And it's 8 p.m. You're welcome to another edition of Fact Sheet live on ETV, live on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle being ETV Ghana. You're welcome to the conversation tonight. If it's not a fact here, we don't discuss them. Tonight, we're talking about public funds. We're talking about your money you pay in the form of taxes, levies, and several other forms it takes for the government to raise revenue and the expenditure projected embarks on within the period that the tenure of the government is not exhausted. Tonight, we're talking about the judicious use of your money. Tonight, we're talking about how every penny that we contribute as citizens of this country is put to good use. The processes, the scrutiny it has to go through before these expenditures are made or done. Tonight, that's where our focus is. And what's informing that? We are talking about the report, 12 of them, that the Auditor General released, first of its kind, which focuses on statutory institutions and agencies and their utilization of states' funds. Now, if you go through that report, you get to realize that there are issues to do with tax irregularities, issues to do with procurement breaches, issues to do with store irregularities and inventory irregularities, issues to do with contractual irregularities in agreements that do not inure to the benefit of Ghana, payroll irregularities, and many more. This is where we are looking at as the Auditor General confirms that some $918.28 million has been lost as a result of these actions of individuals we put at the helm of affairs to manage our funds as a nation. We all would remember that the finance minister consistently since 2017 has been telling us it's proving difficult to meet our revenue target. And so one would think that if we are able to struggle to raise some revenue, its utilization would be properly done. Tonight, our focus is on the Auditor General's report. Now, that report highlights all of these, issues and concerns, and we all talk about it in the media. The Public Accounts Committee, I know, would be starting their work. They are going to some 13 zones to start auditing and then putting people on, asking questions about how they utilize these monies per the report of the Auditor General. But what happens next after the Public Accounts Committee sits and then, the issues to do with the the sanctions regime of our nation? Some people will be surcharged. Some people will be told to refund. But the issues about strong punitive sanctions being applied on these individuals becomes a matter of concern. This would not be the first time that we are reading an Auditor General's report that is so damning and it's gotten all of us concerned. But over the years, what have we done as a nation when these reports come and we go through them? Is it really relevant? The institutions in question, how do we ensure that we streamline their activities that we don't, God willing, next year? Come back to discuss an audit report that is equally as damning as this. My name is Samuel Ishan, and I welcome you to tonight's edition of Fact Sheet. We'll be right back. And you're welcome back to Fact Sheet. Once again, my name is Samuel Ishan. My guest in the studio with me, Mr. Ebenezer Nitaki Obli. Now, he is Executive Director, Conservative Policy Research Center. We're also joined on the phone by Dr. Mohammed Jamal, who is the Director of Research and Innovation at the Koforidua Technical University. So would Madam Mary Ada also join us? She's the Programs Manager for the Ghana Integrity Initiative for us to have this conversation. Eben, good evening.
Good evening.
I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well.
So let me ask how you received the news of the 12 reports of the Auditor General focusing on various institutions of the country and the revelations therein.
Well, I mean, for my part, it's almost becoming like a convention. And as somebody who has been in the civil society space for close to a decade, each and every year you always expect the worst. I mean, you expect that every other year you don't get to see any improvement in terms of the irregularities and all the issues surrounding the Auditor General's report. I mean, if you have been following the governance issues in this country, you should not really expect much or any serious improvement. Yes. So for me, I mean, I expected
it was
that.
To be expected.
Yes, I mean, it's becoming more like a circus. You know, it's like a jamboree. Every year they release the reports. I mean, it's always worse. We get to discuss it for a few weeks, and then that's it. You know, so for me, nothing.
It really doesn't come to you as a surprise. Okay, let me go to the phone lines and speak to Madam Mary Ada and find out how the news got to her when the report came out and the media started, highlighting on the places of concern and the amounts that's involved. All of these are irregularities that one would expect not to hear of, considering that we've been urging ourselves to fight against corruption and these breaches that we've been witnessing over the years. Madam Ada, it's good to have you on the show tonight.
Good to be on the show and good to viewers.
All right, so Ebenezer made the point that it didn't come to me as a surprise, the report and the findings therein. Did it come to you as a surprise when the report started coming out and the details therein?
Not very much. Perhaps the expectation was that since the PFM Act was put in place in 2016, and then also some of the arrangements that have been activated since, for us we were thinking that the audit committee in the various MDAs and MDAs and the various sector agencies would be able to superintend and also guide the process of this recommendation implementation, so that going forward we wouldn't have this repetitive process that we continue to have as a people. But unfortunately, we were disappointed. Disappointed in the fact that if you look at, for instance, the statutory board one, you realize that from 2016 to 2020, from 2016 you have 70% of infractions, about 70 million or thereabouts. Then you go on to 2017 when it's reduced. Then you realize that the reduction is further, it's rather increased. And so it's worrying that even though we continue to put in place certain mechanisms to ensure that we are tackling these infractions when it comes to procurement, when it comes to stores, when it comes to cash and the assets, we continue to have this process. But then the third aspect of it is that the Auditor General continues to repeat almost similar recommendations cutting across the years. And that is really very sad and very unfortunate.
Now, let's try to have an appreciation of the areas, some of which you mentioned, the tax irregularities therein, the procurement irregularities therein, the issues to do with contractual agreements that we signed, the stores and inventories matter. From where you sit, how does it happen that these are places where you'd expect that the checks and balances would be that effective, and yet that's where we are having these loopholes? Hello, Madam Ada.
Okay, is it for me? Okay, great. So what continues to baffle us? And you realize that in most of the instances, like I mentioned, we have a procurement act in place, and we have a public financial management act in place. That is supposed to serve as a check and balance for public sector procurement and spending. And then also to ensure that the various internal controls are activated and working very effectively. Unfortunately, you realize that they continue to be rigid and not happening to counter this that occur on each year basis. And because we have the challenge recur. If we had a process where people are sanctioned for procurement breaches and people are sanctioned for some of the cash irregularities that happen in the institutional level, if the chief director or whoever it is asked to pay back all these amounts, and then we ensure that from the audit committee level, these recommendations effective. The people will be more careful, people will be more diligent, and people will act according to the dictates of the various frameworks that regulate their mandate. Unfortunately, because these lax, they do not see sanctions happening, people are not taken to court, people are not in prison, they continue to engage in this.
All right, Madam Ada, we seem to be losing you a bit, but an area of interest to me, if you are listening to me, it has to do with that of the payroll irregularities. I believe if we cast our minds back between 2017 and 2019, the agitations when it came to how the national security suddenly got involved when it comes to issues to do with the salaries that ought to be paid people, some auditing that was done for people in different institutions, and yet we still have payroll irregularities in our system, even with the national security being involved.
That would tell you the magnitude of the challenge we are contending with. In some of the instances, the belief is that this cannot happen if people who are within the institutions are not complicit. We have a system where I am aware that in most of the institutions, those who are present have to be validated on a monthly basis before their salaries are paid. And so the question we should be asking is, if I'm a teacher and I am validated at the school level, if I'm a primary school teacher, that is, and it goes to the district office, then the district office submits them to the national. Then wherein lies the gap that we have inconsistencies in our payroll? We still have elements of ghosts in our payroll. It means there's some form of complexity that is happening within the system. And many of the internal audit processes at that level, I am not too sure as effective as they should be. And we all understand that they have their challenges because it is an agency, people who are seconded to these institutions are paid by them, and so they cannot speak to some of these issues. And we have had complaints in the past where people have been cited to have, that's the perception anyway, that people pay and then they are able to get their way through. And so national security could do their best, and the various sector agencies can do their best. But when people purport in their heart that they will collude to cheat this nation, they will continue to have these issues. And until I say when sections are not meted out, and when people are not fished out to be set as examples, they will continue to see these behaviors of the greedy few affecting the national interest and then filtrating the public purse, which we are all supposed to be protecting.
Now, for instance, we are told that the government has been embarking on a digitalization exercise, and so that makes for easy trace of transactions as they are records electronically. And so one would have expected that these traces would be that obvious in the systems that it wouldn't take an Auditor General's report to review some of these things, but the systems would check themselves for us to see these even at the assembly level, at the local assembly level, in order to fix the problems before it escalates into what we are seeing now. Now, the second issue too has to do with our structures. I remember former President Barack Obama, when he came to Ghana, he said we should strengthen the institutional structures. These two issues, the digitalization effort, should that not have been one of the kiosks for what we are seeing now?
I believe it still remains one of the key antidotes to our fight against graft and to the pilfering of the public purse. It is key because when we digitize the processes, then the human element is reduced. It would not take it away completely. I say so because let me use the computerized selection placement from basic school to the secondary.
Yeah.
So as an example, you see that even though that process is digitized, there continue to be some elements that infiltrate that system, and you get people who do not deserve to be in certain places being there. But then it is still the best way forward. We need to intensify our digitization agenda. But then what needs to be added to the digitization is to ensure that our monitoring and our tracking, supervision, and again I say supervision of the process should be as strict and should be as rigorous and should be very regular. Because the systems do not work themselves. It is human beings who man these systems. And so if the element of supervision is lax, people would definitely take advantage. And when you talk about systems and strengthening the institutions, one of them is through the digitization agenda and the human capacity as well. If we have the capacity to do the job, we would be able to do it and do it very effectively. Apart from that, logistics is another issue that we need to be dealing with at the various levels. If we are not able to provide the sophisticated logistics to people to be able to monitor the processes, and I'm saying monitoring on an ongoing basis as the process is being carried out, so that you can identify where the gap is and quickly seal it. You know, people would definitely want to cheat. And so it is for the process and the systems to be ahead, one step ahead of the criminal, so that we can continuously monitor, we can continuously identify, we can continuously nip the bud before it even germinates and becomes a butterfly.
Now, before you go off, final question I may ask has to do with the fact that the Public Accounts Committee obviously would start its work, and you know, they'd call the people and it will be telecast live on television, and then we'll see people being found wanting as their inability to answer questions. All that spectacle, is it necessary?
Unfortunately, it was intended to serve a certain purpose, to name and shame. But unfortunately, as time has gone on, we have come to appreciate the fact that people use it as a platform to come and showcase themselves because they are live on TV. So it's beginning to wane, or the purpose for which it was done is beginning to lose that effectiveness, because people are not too perturbed. They come, they sit there, either they are begging or they are justifying their actions, or they are coming to say that the management letters they issued corrected some of the issues they were talking about anyway since the audit happened. And so for me, even though it's supposed to serve a certain purpose, going forward, I believe that looking at the law on causing financial loss, misapplication, for which some selected few have been sanctioned in the past, should be revisited. And our efforts should be towards getting people to answer, getting people punished, because putting them on TV does not serve as a deterrence enough. We need to make sure that people are going to prison and serving the full sentences if they are found culpable.
Is it not a case of a decentralization system that may have some fractures therein? Because what we see at the top, the president, there is that replication of that at the local assembly level where the DC is supposed to be the president. And so if there's a DC as a president, then the Auditor General at the national level would obviously have its own replication at the district level or at the regional level. Is it not a case of these individuals not performing their duties well? That's how come it takes the Auditor General to bring out these findings.
The Auditor General, mind you, the Auditor General's job is done after the fact. It's done after whatever would have been done has been done. And he just goes to identify it. We must not forget that there are issues of capacity in some of the levels. Even though government over time has tried as much as possible to institute measures to curb some of these infractions that continue to be cited. And remember, I mentioned that in the first instance, one of the key things that we must be looking at is strengthening the internal audit function at every level, not just the district assembly. Every level, whether the MDA or district assemblies, there is a need to strengthen the internal control and particularly the internal audit, where they are able to identify some of these infractions before they happen. Unfortunately, as we speak, as I mentioned before, the internal audit function is not too strong because these institutions are the persons who recruit them. And so if you are being too firm, you are either asked to go on transfer or the DCE says, I cannot work with you. And those are the critical challenges, the basic ones at the various agency levels that must be discussed. And so when calls are made that the internal audit agency be turned into a service so that they recruit and then deploy, like controller sends their staff to some of these agencies to effect the payments and others through the gift mix and others. If this is done for the internal audit agency, we would see some remarkable changes happening in the system.
Final one. I said finally, but there's a final one, and that's a very thorny, some may say trivial one, but I felt I need to ask. His Excellency the President, in commending the Acting Auditor General, made the point that he seems to have done better compared to the previous Auditor General, Mr. Domlevo. That position espoused by His Excellency the President, what's your take on that? Was it necessary?
I really do not want to discuss that. But however, let me mention that it is too premature for the President to have conclusively passed that judgment. Why do I say so? I am saying so based on the fact that the former Auditor General is on record to have made some significant gains for this state in millions of Ghana cedis through the surcharge and disallowance mechanism. Unfortunately, in this audit, I don't know whether we are throwing that away, because that's one of the best mechanisms to dissuade people from engaging in wrongful acts or spending without approvals. And so if we do not see that, and the person has just churned out 12 reports, which is supposed to be done on an annual basis, and for that purpose, he is the best, I beg to differ.
I'm grateful, Madam Mary Ada, for making time to join us tonight on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so Ben, I had to have that length lengthy discussion with her because she had another engagement, and so I wanted to exhaust the conversation with her and then come back to the studio with you. So at least we touched on a few things, but let's talk about the issues to do with tax irregularities and the fact that we are struggling to raise our revenue. A lot of that is supposed to be coming from the taxes we generate. And there's been introduction of different taxes that we have been crying about, and a lot of this is being channeled into the pockets of individuals without it necessarily coming into the government's coffers. Do we, from the amount we are seeing from the Auditor General's report, necessarily need tax increments, seeing that a lot of this is going into individuals' pockets?
Well, I mean, let me start off by saying that if you take a comprehensive look at the report, you realize that if we are to take allocative efficiency of the state very seriously, we will not really need a lot of the tax increases that most of the governments try to come up with. Because there's so much wastage and there's so much, I mean, that goes into people's pockets. So for me, we need to take allocative efficiency. For example, it's an important principle in public policy and financial management. If we take countries like Singapore, where you can have budget surpluses, for example, what is the central principle that undergirds such a phenomenon in Singapore? Why can't we have a budget surplus, for example, in Ghana? It boils down to that simple principle of allocative efficiency. And within that framework of thinking, you have to drill down to, in every public system that you create that allows more individual interface as against a systematic interface, then you always have these kinds of situations where taxes or monies that are supposed to go to the state ends up in people's pocket. Why do I say so? If, for example, a road traffic offense, you are engaged in an offense of that nature, and there's a system in place that makes sure you pay to the state without the intervention or the human factor of the police. In that situation, you would have been overcoming some of the issues of what? The human factor, and then the likelihood of corruption. So for me, I think that if we want to really be serious, then we have to take a systems thinking approach to how we look at most of these issues, so that we can get the human factor out and then put in systems, proper systems, where, I mean, most of these things can be checked and traced, as Madam was saying.
Now, let's look at some interesting, highlights of the report where it makes the point that, from 2016, when it comes to these irregularities that we are talking about, it had jumped from around 700 million to around, let's say, 13 billion Ghana cedis. And so that's a huge jump from the millions to the billions. And you ask yourself, these reports are churned out for us to put systems in place to reduce them. And yet, continually we see that they are increasing. Next year's report might see a jump as well. And one would expect that this Auditor General's report, per the actions that will be taken, would be deterrent enough so that next year would rather see a decline than a jump. What factors attribute to these jumps that we see?
I think, the factors are multifaceted. You can't really pinpoint, but let me just attempt to give an explanation. For example, the internal audit function. There's an internal audit agency or internal audit law that is supposed to ensure that, I mean, even before this type of audits, external audit or the Auditor General's work is done, these things are prevented.
Okay.
But the issue is also about how the agency is empowered and the budgetary allocations or commitments from central governments to the internal audit agency. So there's some problem over there. Secondly, there's also the issue about the ARICs, the Audit Recommendation Implementation Committees. These are committees that were supposed to or are supposed to be established to ensure that whatever is recommended, they are not repeated. But it seems like a lot of those committees are not doing what they are supposed to be doing. And thirdly, we have a general systematic problem, which I am more interested in. You know, if you check most of the countries that have been able to deal with tax leakages and most of these issues, they've been able to create a system where they take the human factor out. Okay? And there's general accountability for how resources are used. So we talk about all these big countries, we talk about all these Singapore, Malaysia, and all these countries, but then we don't really try to know what exactly makes them successful. It is about a system that takes human factor out so that there's traceability. And we are lucky that, we're in an era where there's technology available, blockchain and all this other new technology. We have to look at where a system where we take a lot of these human interactions with cash
But
out
can there ever be,
or minimize it?
can there ever be a point where we would say we have minimized, seeing that minimization is relative?
Yes.
Because it will take one person. Let's say in this company there are 10 people who are supposed to be doing the job we are doing now, and then we get a computer to do the job of 9, and it's left with only one person to input the data, feed the data. The addition of just a digit changes the input that is going in there. And so the human element can really not be gotten rid of.
Yes, there's always the human element that you can't get rid of. But for example, if you take, say, let me get back to road traffic offenses. You see, this is an area where government can make a lot of money, right? We need to monetize, for example, indiscipline. We can create a system around that, where when you are caught, for example, for an expired insurance or for driving wrongly or whatever road traffic offense, we should be able to come up with a system that allows the payment for that indiscipline to go straight to central government stores.
Are there systems and structures there to allow for the system you are talking about? Because here we are, if a policeman catches you, you know, even speaking on phone, it's your word against the policeman's word.
Yes.
The only thing is that in our court system, in our judicial system, there's a possibility for the policeman's word to be, you know, taken more than yours because he says he has arrested you for doing that. But maybe you may not have been doing that. But if we have systems where there are cameras at different places where if a policeman says, I saw you talking on your phone and is able to produce video evidence to that effect, then we'll be having this conversation. But we don't have that in place. So then how do we monetize?
Well, you see, that's what I'm saying. It's systemic thinking involves a lot of things. It involves logistics. It involves the whole value chain, thinking about how to get it to become effective. That is a general or a big picture position that I'm trying to advocate. That we need to sit down and look at systems thinking.
All right.
We don't do systems thinking in Ghana.
All right.
That is unfortunately the truth. We rather look at incremental situations. But for you to say a system, it requires a lot of thinking. It requires a lot of planning. It requires a lot of resources, and it requires a lot of stakeholder engagement. You know, so I mean, we need to get to the point where we begin to look at systems, proper systems, to check some of these things. You know, so for example, take for example the reforms that are currently taking place at the lands sector. Brilliant ideas, okay? And that is what we should be doing, so that we digitize land documents to the point where you don't need to pay for anybody to get you any land information. I should be able to get the details of my land just on my phone. These are things we should be thinking. This is systems thinking.
Let me go to Dr. Mohammed Jamal and speak to him via phone and ask a few questions, at least for Eben and Madam Ada. We've been speaking about the document itself, but as we speak, from yesterday, the Public Accounts Committee looked in the direction of Tamale. That's where they are starting their zonal, public accounts sitting to investigate some institutions in that area. Now, Doc, let me begin with the activities of the Public Accounts Committee and what we witness when they start their works. Now, is their work, with all we see, indeed that relevant still?
Yeah, good evening, and good evening to Eben in the studios, and good evening to your listeners. But let me before I get into the question that you asked me, let me just take a bit on what means by financial regulators. Okay. If you take your time and then you look around literature, one may explain that as an intentional misstatement or an omission of information related to financial transaction. That is financial irregularities. So if you look at intentional misstatement or omission of information related to financial transactions, then you marry that one to corruption, which is dishonesty or criminal offense. So if you read the report, you realize that the report keeps highlighting irregularities. Are you okay? This thing continuously resurfaces for several years down the lane, and we keep seeing irregularities. But the fact is that the citizenry must be told what an irregularity means. That is one. And two, they must be explained to understand what impact that an activity term irregularity performed or undertaken by somebody from the citizenry. Because it affects all of us. In any way, if we come to this, let's talk about what you just talked about. Article 187, okay? If you take Article 187 of the Constitution, Clause 6, okay, they will say that Parliament shall debate the report of the Auditor General and appoint, where necessary, in the public interest, a committee to deal with any matters arising from it. Let's tie that one to Article 187.11, which talks about the fact that the salaries allowances and general shall be charged on the constitution. No, let's start that to 12. 12. I want something from 12 here, which has to do with disallowance. Are you okay? So that is 10. The rules of the court committee may, by constitutional instrument, make rules of court and the purpose of clause of what the article is seeking to do. Then the 9 talks about the fact that a person aggrieved, this is what I want, a person aggrieved by a disallowance or a surcharge made by the Auditor General may apply to the High Court. Let me tie that to the question that you just asked me. Day in and day out, we keep seeing Parliament, as part of their function under Article 187, Clause 6, trying to debate the report as presented by the Auditor General. And in doing this, they try to, I don't want to use the word query them, but they do that as part of their mandate as a body. But the question is, does it actually serve the needs and the aspiration of the society? In my point of view, I would say that it is just one of the functions as prescribed by the Constitution, which they are doing. But inherent in the function they were supposed to do was to set up a committee, okay, that they should set up a committee when necessary in the public interest. And the committee shall deal with matters that arise with as far as the irregularities are concerned. Tell me, from time immemorial up to now, which of the committees have they set up to deal with people who have actually caused irregularities as far as either financial or whatever is concerned? It has not been done. So you see Parliament query people at the glare of everybody in the country. You see that people talk about it for weeks and that ends it. Because at the end of the day, we expected Parliament to act, and in the deed of acting, they will set up another committee to actually tease out those issues which are inimical to the growth of the public sector, and or which affront the PFF Act 2016. But Parliament keep doing the regular things that they have been doing, and at the end of the day, people are left off the hook. My friends, just imagine the quantum of jump in the irregularities that we have noticed. Even though we may say that some of these, if they have been whether they have responded to them or not, but in totality, 107 is very terrible. So Parliament sitting is legal, is by law. We cannot do that. But the question is that at the end of the day, are they going to have another way by which we can get these things resolved? Because if we continuously have this and it keep on coming, you see citizens losing interest in even public issues. They will lose interest even in social contracts. Now, and tying this to the generality, I was going to look at it from social point of view, economic point of view, and political point of view. And each of these, when you pick it, you realize that it is not just an auditor report that the Auditor General has provided. It is something that has a social contract with the citizens of the country, of which people are elected to delve into it and see how they can resolve it, which doesn't actually tie it up.
Well, so I was asking the question about relevance. I mean, as for the constitutional mandatory task they have to perform, I mean, it's guaranteed. But I was asking about the relevance because the report highlights department, agencies, sometimes individuals culpable in these instances. So for us to sit down, for Parliament to call these same institutions and come for them to ask them questions that maybe the Auditor General in the course of doing its auditing would have asked, and then at the end of the day, we see all these things. Does the report not capture these things already?
But it is relevant because it's a constitutional duty. And you see, sometimes we say the burden of proof. At the same time, when you allege that someone has done A, B, C, D, you should also give the person the benefit of the doubt to prove his innocence. Are you okay? So the relevance comes as a result of the fact that the people need to be given an opportunity to respond. And because the Constitution has prescribed the manner in which the response should be done, that is why it's supposed to be done that way. But one thing is that, and I'm foreseeing those into the future, you see the rise of civil society organizations. There will be times that civil society organizations will mount pressure on Parliament, such that the action or what they will just do will not just be a showcase. It will be one that Parliament will move a step further to see how they can implement the committee level to deal with these issues that they have raised. And so, in the context of in the context of the law, it is still very relevant. And two, in the context of public information, because the public needs to have information, because this information is a social contract that binds the public and government performances and even all these ministries. And so we expect Parliament to query people who have actually flouted these laws. And after they have been queried, we also expect the public not just be like spectators or just onlookers. We should have civil society organizations who actually have knowledge in quantifying how deteriorating this has on the economy to speak up. In many countries, you can even see that we have in many jurisdictions, as I hear Eben keep talking and mentioning, if you look at Singapore, you look at others, they respect the value attached by civil society organizations to growth. At the same time, the civil society organizations are able to contribute by way of making input to their growth and development. And so, if Parliament is supposed to perform a parliamentary function, we expect that the citizenry might, or they should see it as a duty that they also have to also perform. by way of contributing, either talking about it, by way of even there is a way, or smearing the activity, making it look like it is a bad thing has happened to the country. In essence, it's a bad thing. And so we cannot say that that function should be, because if the parliament doesn't go to it, none of us has any opportunity to be able to do that. So parliament will still have to do that. Once they do that, we as citizens should also contribute our quota by pushing parliament to do the right thing.
All right, Doc, we will take a short breather. When we come back, I'll ask 2 questions and we'll be done for tonight and make way for Girl Vibes. And they have a very interesting conversation coming up tonight. I encourage you to stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Fact Sheet Live on ETV Live on Facebook as well. I've seen several comments that I may read 1 or 2 if time allows us, but I believe we have 8 more minutes before the show comes to an end. Anyway, so I realized that the Public Accounts Committee this time around is doing something different. Now, they say that they are moving to the regions to bring the process to the doorstep of the people in the community to know the gravity of what they are doing there. Is that going to do anything at all?
Well, it's part of the process. You know, in public accountability, we have a term, we call it the fiscal covenant. And the fiscal covenant basically talks about the relationship between citizens, the administrative state, and of course civil society, and its overall relationship with the use of resources. And within that framework, or within that thinking, is that in the utilization of public resources, there must be clear-cut rules of how resources are to be used. So on that score, we have the public financial management law. Then there should be institutions that will engender a process of how those resources will be expended and how they will be accounted for. On that score, we have Parliament and the people. And then there should be institutional safeguards to keep an eye on how the resources are to be used. On that score, we have CSOs and think tanks. And then there's the general thinking around accountability. So if you look at most of the mentor countries that we look up to, what they have been able to do very well has been those 2 things: the development of a proper fiscal covenant and also allocative efficiency. What we are doing is an evolving type of fiscal covenant, but the accountability aspect, where you need civil society to be actively involved in the process, is lacking in Ghana. You know, our case is quite interesting. We have the situation where the state is rather antagonistic to civil society. And if you find yourself in the development narrative where the central government or political leadership has a rather antagonistic posture towards civil society, then in the process of the evolving fiscal covenant, you have that aspect: institutional safeguards and accountability lacking. So it's a big problem. If you take a deep look at the countries we look up to, they've been able to do that basically because they've developed all these structures. We are developing it, but it's like there's no commitment to that process. So that's where the issue is. When you develop to the point where you have an enduring fiscal covenant, that is the point where each and every person within the process, the development process, understands his responsibility. Citizens expect accountability because you are using their resources. Parliament is supposed to be an umpire over the executive. Then you have civil society deeply involved. You know, we call it the tripartite process, or the what some people call the third way consensus. Government here, citizens here, CSOs here. But in our case, most of the problems we are facing generally is because we are not allowing that angle of the development of the fiscal covenant. So that is something that the state or all of us we have to look at. For example, it's very difficult to even go to a ministry and to say you are demanding certain information.
But we have the right to information.
Yes, we have the right, but because we haven't gotten to that level of understanding what the fiscal covenant entails, that's why it's a problem. Because the countries we are looking up to, it is something that they even do it before the citizens go asking for information. For example, if I ask you to go to the Ministry of Finance and tell us since the first Eurobond up to now, all the bonds we have raised, they should take the prospectus of each, because before you raise the bond, you have to show the prospect what you use the funds for and all of that. Go and ask the ministry to give us all those prospectuses and then tell us whether they follow through with whatever they said they were going to use the monies for in those prospects. It's going to be a big problem.
All right.
You know, but that is the troubles we find ourselves.
Eben, I'm sure our continual, tete-a-tete and conversation would one day lead to a situation where we would have these mechanisms in place and, we wouldn't annually come sit here and talk about the Auditor General's report. But my name is Sambalishan. I've been here tonight with Ebenezer Ni Taki Obli, who is the Executive Director for the Conservative Policy Research Center. And we're joined on the phone line by Madam Mary Ada, who is the Programs Manager for the Ghana Integrity Initiative, and Dr. Mohammed Jamal, who is Director, Directorate of Research and Innovation at the Koforidua Technical University. On that note, we'll thank you for being a part of the conversation tonight and for watching us live on ETV. Girl Vibes is up next. Good night.